Okay, everybody, welcome to the Hoplite channel. I am your host, Hop, and you clicked on this video because you saw the title, America 2020 and Beyond. So for today, I decided to do a video a little bit different than what I normally would do. I'm jumping into a political topic, obviously. This video is coming to you on the 4th of July. I'm filming it on the night before. And yeah, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about what's going on in this country and why I think certain things are happening the way they are, and what we can expect possibly going forward in the United States. I did a lot of soul searching over the last couple weeks, just seeing what was going on, everything with the pandemic, and then you had the civil unrest with the protests and the riots, and then just civil order breaking down. You had this nonsensical tree fort going on in Seattle. First they called themselves Chaz, then Chop. Then a bunch of people got shot or sexually harassed. And then eventually the mayor said, okay, move the cops in and kick them out. And I think that happened yesterday. So yeah, a lot of nonsense going on in the United States. And I think there's a good explanation as to why. I'm not saying this is the explanation. I'm just saying this is as good an explanation as I've been able to come up with. Bigger picture, right? This is not just us living in the here and now in 2020. This is America and beyond. So what is it going to look like in the future if this is our present, right? We should always be thinking about that. This is where I am today, but is my tomorrow going to look different? And if it is different, what am I doing today, or what is going on with me today that will take me into that future? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it right? Is it wrong? Will I want to live in that future? So maybe with some of these explanations I'm about to come up with, you'll see where I'm going as to why this is going nowhere good fast. I hate to say it. I mean, I know it's the 4th of July, and if you're watching this, you should be outside enjoying, barbecue and family and fireworks, whatever. But if you're watching this now, I'll tell you right now, this is probably going to be a bit of a downer video. But this is just, what I've come to realize. I've been alive now for almost 4 decades, so I have a little bit of insight, a little bit of thinking under my belt to say that I've assessed enough of opinions, enough facts, enough history to make this conclusion. And if you disagree, please put it in the comments, and if you agree, feel free to agree. But anyway. What is America? Well, it's obviously the country we live in today, but how did we get here, right? How did we get from point A to point B? Well, we started obviously as a colony. We were a colonial settlement of a greater country at the time. This would have been in the late 18th century. This would have been Great Britain, the royal empire that was England. And we decided as a colony that we weren't just going to continue being a colony under the rule of Great Britain, but that we were going to do things our own way. So we decided to more or less give Great Britain the finger and declare ourselves a nation. That's what we did. The United States became a nation unto itself, and was so by the 1800s. Great Britain tried to keep that from happening, but we had other ideas, and that was that. History is pretty clear that we separated from Great Britain, we became our own nation, and moved forward from there. And then as time went by, we grew as a nation, and then right around World War II, there was a incredible sea change in how the world was going to work from there forth. The United States went into World War II as a world power, but emerged as a superpower. And that became a new term because it had never existed, right? You had Russia, you had the United States as pretty much the two dominant forces now in the world post-World War II. So the United States went from a little ragtag group of colonists to a superpower in less than 150 years, which is incredible. Yeah, to literally go from a colony signing its, its constitution, prior its declaration, and then in 150 years it would be at the top of the heap of all the other countries in the world. And I think because of our meteoric rise to this superpower status, we're seeing such a meteoric fall back to earth. Because as we become a superpower, we are today a country. We are no longer a nation, and I'll explain why in a second. And we are a superpower that is waning back into a country. And unfortunately, if you're a student of history, you know these things. Any massive power that cannot maintain its status as an empire or a superpower, it devolves into a country, and then that country devolves into dust. It collapses. It does not sustain itself. You don't go from superpower to country back to superpower. Maybe that's happened, but rare. Extremely rare. I'm trying to even think of an instance where that happened, where once a superpower empire was broken down into a country or series of countries, it ever came back. You could say maybe the Holy Roman Empire, but once Rome was destroyed, it didn't become Rome again. Like, it had its time, right? The better part of 700 years. But once it was broken down and the Dark Ages took over, the Holy Roman Empire that cobbled, what was left of it together, wasn't really Rome. I mean, it was something else, maybe similar in some respect, but not Rome. It never reached the heights of what was once Rome. So America right now is a country. And yeah, countries that were once nations that were superpowers, we're sliding all the way to the bottom here. But in a way, hitting rock bottom is probably the best thing that could happen to us. And I think that's what has to happen to us if there's a chance at a decent future. It's just unfortunate that we are living in this time now where we are in the last days of a superpower that is skidding into a country that is skidding towards the dustbin of history. I'm going to get a lot of hate for that, but it's happening. I can feel it. I can see it. I think you can see it too. This country isn't the country that I grew up in. Sure as hell isn't the country my parents grew up in, and it definitely isn't the country my grandparents grew up in. So let's explain the difference as to why America now as a country is on its way down, and why America as a nation was on its way up, and why nations succeed and countries fail. Nation, we have two words, right? Nation and country. Like, why don't we just have one? Because there's a difference. Nation is a word we derive from the Latin root nat or natio, and it means birth, right? If a woman's pregnant and she goes to the doctor, well, she's getting prenatal care, right? Prenatal, natio, pre-birth. You're getting care prior to the birth of your child. Prenatal, you get it. Natal, natio, birth. A nation is then one people of common birth. What do people that share common birth have in common, right? Common birth, what commonalities exist? Race. A nation is most importantly dictated by its race. That is the fundamental similarity that nations will have in common. And as such, these common races develop common culture, right? So someone gave me a great example. If you took let's say a Saxon who was living, on the island of Great Britain, and you moved him to China, and then you moved someone who was Chinese to Great Britain, and they had no idea they were in different countries, would that Saxon be able to create the same culture that the Chinese man in China would have made had he stayed. It's the saying that, are these two interchangeable, right? You have a Saxon, right? And someone who was living, I don't know if it would be like, a Chinese dynasty. If you would just swap these two, would the person from China be able to create or develop the same culture a Saxon would if they were now living in Britain and if the Saxon was living in China? People would say no. It's just the way it happens, right? It's just different races create different cultures. And you could say it has a lot to do with their geography and the history in that geography, in that individual place. But to say that people are interchangeable and that you can move them from one area of the globe to the other and expect the exact same culture to spring forth from that area, regardless of the person occupying it, is naive, right? So you have race, and from race comes culture. And part of culture, of course, would be religion and language. These four different categories are what make a nation, right? So if you have a chair, it'll have four legs. And the four legs of the chair hold it up, just as the four legs of a nation are what hold it up. So a nation is one. And it's one people that have these four different facets in common. Race, culture, religion, language. That makes a nation, okay? Can a nation be a country? Sure. Is a country necessarily a nation? No. And here's why. So country is a word that we derive from the Latin root contra, which means against or opposite. Now that's interesting, right? Country comes from the word contra, that means against. How do we get country from that? Well, it simply means that you are in a country and your space that you're occupying is in opposition to other spaces, right? I am here, you are there. Your space is up against my space. This space, my country, is what I have in opposition to you and your space and your country. And it's merely a political state or the populace therein, right? The country has spoken. That is the populace. A country is divided by these four characteristics: laws, borders, infrastructure, and an economy. And this country can be comprised of many different people, because you don't need to have these four characteristics in common if you have these four as the only prerequisites, right? So we go back to another Latin saying that was popular at the foundation of America as a nation, and I don't know if Ben Franklin or Adams came up with it, but it was e pluribus unum. And you can see this, I think it's on coins and on dollar bills still. And it simply means from many one, right? So from many different states and from many different colonies, we have one nation, right? So from the many different facets that would be America, we have one nation because we have these four things in common, right? Despite the fact that we occupy different parts of the country that is the United States, we are still one nation because these are the four underlying legs to the chair that is our country. But in a country, you just have pluribus, you have many, right? You don't need to make one people from many. You just have many different interests, many different people occupying one space, one country. A nation can be a country, but a country is not necessarily a nation. Okay, here's the big question, and I want you to think about this on the 4th of July. Of these two, which is worth fighting for? Okay? If you're part of a nation and you are part of a common race, which has a common culture and a common religion, speaking a common language, would you rather fight for that, or would you rather fight for a country that only has laws, borders, infrastructure, and an economy in common, right? So let's say we go and we say, well, my country's worth fighting for. Okay, the laws. We've seen in the past couple weeks that the laws in this country of the United States are supposed to be universal, but are they really? They're not really being applied universally now. Like in some instances, you had states that were telling individual businesses they weren't allowed to open because there was a pandemic going on. You had other states that said we will not allow people to congregate and develop into mobs that will smash in windows and loot. Other places said the police will not intervene if there is a large gathering and even if that gathering turns violent. So you could say right there that the laws are still very subjective in this country. And it really just depends who is in control to decide if the laws of this country will be applied and if the application of those laws will be equitable. But also, if you think about the laws of the United States, the laws that we have go directly back to our foundation as a nation. We took them from the English jurisprudence that the colony of America inherited from the larger country of Great Britain. Great Britain derived much of their jurisprudence from the Greco-Roman tradition, which would be common law. So how can you say that our laws aren't a bygone era of the time of when we were a nation? If we're a country and we become more and more of a diverse people, who's to say that the laws aren't a relic of the past that need to be modified and changed? So you're not going to find much commonality in that. Borders. Yeah, we have borders. If you go look on a map, there are distinct borders. Are they being defended? Not really. Not really. I mean, our southern border in particular is such a hot button political issue, and nobody can seem to agree. Do we defend these borders or do we just let people come and go as they please? The fact that that's even a debate tells you that these borders are arbitrary. It really just depends who's in control. Will they be enforced or won't they? Infrastructure. Yeah, we have roads, okay? I can drive from East Coast to West Coast and back and all places in between. We have fiber optic cable. I can go on PlayStation or Xbox or whatever, log in, and I can play games with my buddies all over the United States or even beyond. So we have infrastructure to link the many states together. Is that really worth fighting for? Not really. I mean, it's great to have this infrastructure in a first world country, but that alone, I mean, no one's going to tell you that you need to go to war to fight for your country because, well, we've got really great Wi-Fi. And lastly, the economy. And this is the big selling point of a country. And just like infrastructure, it's a loser. Try to make an army advertisement that wants young recruits to sign up so they can fight for corporatism and capitalism abroad. They don't sell you that. They sell you these four things. They don't say them explicitly, but implicitly, this is what you're allegedly fighting for. But what they really mean is the economy, right? The United States now has become so synonymous with capitalistic entrepreneurial business that it really has no identity beyond our devotion to this economic system. And there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, capitalism, thank God for it, it has given the world so many different things that would have otherwise been impossible. But because of individualism and capitalism, we were able to come up with things because, number one, there was a need, and number two, someone could make a profit if they made it. But again, those inventions and that individualism was a product of America as a nation. As a country, economics is something that people will look at as fundamentally unfair if there are so many different races, cultures, religions, and languages that if there's not a common economy, as in I make as much money as somebody else, but maybe I could make more. It's like, well, do I have a right to make more? Because if I do, it's like, what about everybody else? If you have these four things in common, then this is the one thing you can have in distinction, right? And my ability to make more money, to be a better capitalist, and I have these four things in common with my fellow countrymen in my nation, therefore they can't hold these against me. If I try to make more money and be a better capitalist in my country, but I don't have these four things in common, people will hold these four things against you. Or you're only making more money because you're of that particular religion. Or you know what, you speak this language and that's the language of this country as a nation. That means you have an edge. Or you're only making more money than me because you're in a privileged race. And this culture is toxic because it fosters this race and this religion over me and my religion. Therefore, it's wrong. So an economy will only take you so far. People aren't going to fight for an economy. They aren't going to fight for an infrastructure. They're definitely not going to fight for borders, as we can see. And the laws will be very subjective. These four things are immutable. And that's why nations survive countries. Countries will not survive nations. And that's why America now has moved from a nation into a country after this brief stint as a superpower, which lasted 60 some years. That's where we're headed. That's why you see all these things happening on TV. And I made this video because I saw 2 days ago in Richmond, Virginia, they took down the statue of Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson, if you don't know who he was a famous commander in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He's famous. He got his name Stonewall because during a battle, while the cannons were firing and shells were falling and men were dying all around him, Jackson stood there like a stone wall. Like he had this fearlessness about him. It's like Richard the Lionheart, Stonewall Jackson. That's how he got his name. They took him down. And the mob of people who don't care for the culture of America in this part of the world, in this part of the country rather, saw to it that those in charge of the laws bent to their will and said, you have to erase this part of your culture. That's what happens in a country. That's not what happens in a nation. A nation of people would have come out and said, no, despite the fact that you might not like Stonewall Jackson, and I literally have no dog in the fight because I grew up in the North, but I still regard him as a legend in American history. For good or evil, he's part of the story. Don't cut out parts of my story because you want to spare me the bad news. I want my story to be told, and I want that story to be one page in the many pages that is the American novel. And Stonewall's part of it. In countries, people can move the mob and move the masses enough so that they become unreasonable enough to make you disregard and tear down your culture. And I can't help but think that this is literally what happens when a country starts circling the drain. It starts erasing its history and it starts letting a small vocal minority that is unreasonable dictate what history can stay and what has to go. But I got news for you people, that just because Stonewall Jackson left today doesn't mean they're not going to come for more tomorrow. This will keep going. And this is why there are dark days ahead for America, right? We are not going back to a nation, right? The race, the culture, the religion, the language. Once we became a superpower, we moved away from this and we moved towards that. And history will show you when you move away from this and you move towards that, what you're really moving towards is that. You're giving up the fundamental four legs of a chair that will sustain you. And I'll show you some examples right here, right? So let's talk about 3 countries that demonstrate this point very clearly. So let's begin with United States, right? Because that's what we're talking about. Let's talk about race. Right now, and I rounded these figures up, 61% of America is white, 19% is Hispanic, 14% is black, and 6% is Asian, okay? There's no commonality there. You could not say that we have one common birth as far as race goes anymore. Culture. Well, we have an American culture, right? We have Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. We got hip-hop, we got country, we got rock and roll. We've got Christmas, we've got Kwanzaa, we've got Hanukkah, we've got Ramadan. We got all that stuff. We've got the MAGA folks, and we've got the BLM Antifa folks. We've got people who watch Friends, people who watch The Office. That's the ugliest battle of all, by the way. So yeah, the American culture is capitalism. That's our culture. And like I said, if the economy is the one thing you're trying to sell me on as far as a country, I'm not dying over Coca-Cola making more money. I'm not dying over somebody watching Friends and their right to watch Friends. And as much as I love Christmas and all the other holidays, that's not going to be enough to get people to put on your uniform and defend your country. Religion. 76% of Americans identify as Christians, be it Catholics, Mormons, Lutherans, Protestants, etc. 2% Jewish, 1% Muslim, 3% other. This would be Buddhist, Taoist, Zoroastrian, what have you. And then 18% claim to be atheist, agnostic, or unaffiliated. So that's a pretty diverse mix there. I mean, 76% are Christians, so that's obviously the majority. But I wouldn't say that's, a common, facet of a nation. 76% adhering to this religion. And as a Christian myself, I'm going to say that people who say they're Christian, that's probably just what they said for the survey. So anyway. And lastly, language. 80% of Americans speak English, which means 20% don't. So really, if you get down to it, the only leg America has left to sit on, as far as the chair, is language. 80% of Americans still speak English, 20% don't. But race, no commonality. Culture, like I said, the only commonality is green, the dollar. And religion, 76 Christian, 18% agnostic, and the rest in between. Yeah, so there's that. All right, now let's look at another country. Actually, two other countries. We've got China and Saudi Arabia. China is 91.5% Asian, or specifically Han Chinese, and 8.5% are other, which would be different Asian races and perhaps Western nation races. So 91.5 is Asian. Yeah, that's common birth, that's commonality. They have race in common. What about the culture? Well, it's whatever the government says culture will be. That means anything local and national customs and holidays that are practiced. Once they pass the green light for the CCCP, you can have that as your culture. So yeah, they have culture in common. Despite the fact that it's not great that the government decides these things, it still exists as a commonality. What about the religion? Well, most Chinese would probably tell you, if they were on camera, they worship the state. The state is their religion. Off camera, they might tell you this. 18% are Buddhist, 5.1% are Christian, 22% subscribe to a folk religion, which would be something within the Chinese culture historically, 2% other, and 52% unaffiliated. So even 52% in a blind survey would say they're unaffiliated, which means they're either agnostic, atheistic, or the state is their religion. So the state has control over religion, and you could say there's that commonality. If the state says no religion, well, that's the new religion. And lastly, language. 73% of Chinese speak Mandarin, 13% speak another Chinese dialect, and then 10 to 15% speak other. So actually, the United States has China beat in the language department. Only 73% speak Mandarin, but an extra 13% still speak a variation of a Chinese dialect. So I call that a wash. It's kind of a tie. I'd say they still have the language characteristic of a nation. So yeah, China has all four legs of a nation. They are a nation, more so than a country. Lastly, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Race. 90% of Saudi Arabia is Arab, and 10% is Afro-Asian. I tried to find a definition as to what Afro-Asian means, And I couldn't find anything. So regardless, 90%'s Arab. Yeah, that's common birth. They have the common racial characteristics of a nation. What's their culture? Well, it's Arabic, right? And that's dictated by Islam, which is the state religion, and Sharia law. So your culture is permissible in Saudi Arabia so long as it's endorsed by the theocracy and there are no conflicts with Sharia law. So yeah, their culture, it's national. What about their religion? Well, I just mentioned that earlier. Roughly 99% of people living in Saudi Arabia are Muslim, which means they are either subscribers of Sunni Islam or Shia Islam. And I think Sunni is the vast majority, with 75 to 85% being Sunni and 10 to 15% being Shia. But yeah, in Saudi Arabia, I believe Mecca and Medina are off limits to non-Muslims. So yeah, they've got religion down pat. Yeah, that's a solid leg right there. In Saudi Arabia, Islam is the religion, no question about it. Imagine in America, 76% Christian. You weren't allowed to go to Philadelphia or Salt Lake City if you weren't Christian. Yeah, how long would that fly? Yeah, 0 minutes. Okay, and language. Approximately 95% speak Arabic, and the three dialects of Arabic are Hijazi, Najdi, and Gulf or Southern dialects. So yeah, they've got language too. So China and Saudi Arabia, not saying I would ever move there, not saying they're great countries, but they are nations. And the country, the people, the borders of that country, within those borders, they have a nation, and they will survive. Now people are going to say, well, the Chinese economy is largely debt, and it would collapse if we were, if we were gone. But yeah, we would collapse too, right? Because we're buying their cheap goods. They sell us cheap goods. It's symbiotic, right? Without us, they go away. Without them, we go away. But if we're operating on this as the four corners, the four legs of our chair, but they still have these four legs, they can collapse and rebuild with these four commonalities. You are not rebuilding a country that only had these four things in common. When you don't have a common race and a common culture and a common religion, and you have even given up a common language, there is nothing in common worth fighting for. There is nothing in common worth building. This is what's happening in America today. It's been happening for years. The reason you see what you see on the television is because the tree is bearing this fruit, this bitter fruit. And I don't see us finding a way back to this without avoiding that. What I'm saying is that if we gave up this for this temporary pedestal, but it earned us this, we are not getting back to a nation without a hard collapse. And that's just the truth of it. It happened to Rome, right? Like Rome collapsed, the empire gave itself away. Before, it was very finite, it was very proud, it was very nationalistic, common race, common culture, common language, common religion. But then it grew too big. It grew into the empire, and it negotiated the best parts of its nation away. Well, you can be a Roman too. Okay, now there are too many people who are Romans. All right, well, what if the barbarians invade? Well, pay those barbarians to fight those barbarians, and as long as they're fighting each other, they won't invade us. What if they join forces? I don't know. What about if we permit Christianity to take over the empire? Or what if we permit Judaism? What if we permit this? Okay, well, we're worried about right now about being invaded by different races and cultures that have these four things in common. The tribes of barbarians that invaded Rome had these four things in common. So it was literally like a pack of wolves jumping on the back of an aging elephant, and the wolves brought it down. I shouldn't say elephant. I mean, elephants and wolves don't really, you wouldn't find them together, but you get it. That's where America is right now. We are being brought down from the inside out. And other countries like China or Saudi Arabia or elsewhere that see you giving up these four corners of your square, these four legs, in exchange for these four legs, they know they can beat you in the long run. Because even though you have superpower status, on the inside, if this is all that's sustaining you, that's junk food, right? That doesn't make a healthy people. The economy is the only thing you have propping that up. Laws, borders, infrastructure, that's all well and good. But if your people become so different from each other on these four bases, they won't look at each other and say, hey, these are worth fighting for, even though we're so different based on this. No. A nation is worth fighting for. A country is not. And I just wish more Americans saw this coming. And I'm not saying that, there needs to be a civil war. I'm saying that I don't see how this doesn't result in something catastrophic, because that's what's happened to all nations of the world that devolved from nations to superpowers, down into countries, then into broken provinces, and then into irrelevance. Right. Okay. I said it was going to be pretty black-pilled, a pretty sad video, but I can't help but see what's going on in my country. I wish I could call it a nation. I can't help but see what's going on and not make this deduction. So again, as I said, I hope you're enjoying this 4th of July. It's part of our culture. Who knows how long we'll have it, right? Because if we don't have a common race, religion, we still have a language. If we don't have a common culture, like we're losing another leg. And if we give up parts of our culture, be it a Stonewall Jackson statue, or Mount Vernon, or Monticello, or the Washington Monument, or the St. Louis Arch, whatever, it's part of our culture. These structures exist to reflect our status as a nation. And if you don't have a nation, countries don't maintain their culture. And we could lose it. So I do hope you're enjoying the day for what you have while we have it. I'll be taking it easy. But anyway, I felt like this was a video worth doing just because it had been on my mind. So if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you think somebody else would find it interesting, feel free to share it. But anyway, I'll get back to some of my more middle of the road videos, and we'll get back to the readings, the saga of Hrolf Kraki. But anyway, I just felt like I had to get this one off my chest. But in any event, happy 4th of July. God bless America. Take it easy.